Well, hello and welcome to Ground Level's Wednesday Wisdom. Today we're delighted to be joined by Claudia from 318. Claudia, I'd love it if you could just introduce yourself and talk a bit about who you are and who 318 is too.
Yeah, hi, thanks Jason, and thanks for inviting us. Yeah, so my name's Claudia Bell. I work as Head of Learning and Influence at 318. 318, we're an independent Christian safeguarding charity. We have been in existence for over 40 years, supporting churches and faith-based organisations to do safeguarding well. We equip them, we support them through a range of services that we offer, and that's from our helpline, our safeguarding helpline, to our training, which is what I oversee. So my role at 318 as Head of Learning Influence is to have strategic lead for our training on one sense, so kind of our learning offer, the support that we offer to churches in terms of equipping them, and then also research. So we work with academic institutions to do some timely and relevant research, which helps us to kind of steer what we provide in our services, how we continue to support churches ongoing. So that's a little bit about my role and what I do, which is it's twofold. It's a busy role, but also I'm one of a number of other heads of departments who oversee our other services, which is consultancy. So that might be working with churches to support them around safeguarding audits or past case reviews or whatever their specific need is. I think what's good about what we do at 318 is we respond to what the need is that churches bring to us, and they'll commission us to do a piece of work that may be quite discreet or maybe quite high profile. So we've been involved in some high profile cases recently that you may or may not, people may or may not be aware of. And so, yeah, I think what's important to say for me is that I love my job and I'm really passionate about it, but I'm not my job. And I always say this, so, you know, I'm also a mum and a wife, and like everybody else, I've experienced the pandemic over the last 12 months, juggling that alongside my work. But my professional background is in social work, so that's kind of my kind of where I kind of come from in terms of work and the strand of work that I do now.
Great. It feels like we've got a real expert with us today. So
I don't know about that. I'm learning. I've learned loads and still got lots to learn. Yeah.
Well, I think that's one of the first points, isn't it, Claudia, that this is an area where we're always learning and adapting, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we'd love to ask you a few questions, and really the aim of our session today is just to kind of keep churches thinking about safeguarding and how safeguarding might be changing at the moment as church is changing and how everything is currently changing, isn't it? And so I suppose one of the first questions that would be great to just understand is what your role is in supporting churches. What is it you do as an organisation to support churches, and how can they tap into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been around, as I said, for about 40 years, and we're a member organisation. So we encourage churches and organisations to join membership with us, and that will give them access to a range of services. So membership will give them access to our resources. So we have what's called a really helpful safeguarding manual that we have online, and it's embedded into what we've created over the years of 10 standards. And it gives churches and organisations an opportunity to really think about how they operate in safeguarding and to have those 10 standards in place. And there's a whole host of resources. So people visit our website, they'll find some of those. Much of what we offer is in the public domain. Some of what we offer is also for members only. So we'd encourage people to join membership with us where they can. And that will also give them access to our DBS service. So one of the teams that we have is a really busy DBS team who are processing DBS checks along supporting churches to do safer recruitment well. And then we also have our helpline. So our helpline really is one of our kind of flagship services, I think I would say, that churches have really benefited from. So it's, you know, when churches are really stuck, if someone's stuck with an issue, they can ring us and they can get practical, on the spot help and advice and guidance. And when we pride ourselves in kind of making sure that we send that to them so people are really clear what they need to do, so they won't come off that call hopefully still feeling lost and thinking, I don't know what to do. That our helpline, we've got a team of advisors that will pick up the phone and just listen. And sometimes that can be anything from, you know, don't know how to write a policy, to actually we've had a serious disclosure from a child or a family, or we're concerned about somebody in our church, or we've got an offender in our church, whatever it might be. we'll listen and we'll give advice to that and speak into that. But I think, you know, our services broadly, it's growing as well. It's grown from when I started. I've worked for 318 for 10 years now, over 10 years, and it's changed, it's grown, we're responding all the time. So in the day, we're at the other end of the phone. People can look at our website, they can ring us and see what we have to offer, but also our training. Can't talk to me and me not talk about training, given that's my department, but you know, we have a whole host of training courses to equip people, so people don't need to feel that they don't know what to do, and we've broken that down into foundation training courses. So for those that are kind of entry level or working directly with children and young people or adults on a day-to-day basis, we have our foundation courses, and then we have some of our specialist courses around domestic abuse, spiritual abuse, pastoral care and supporting survivors, and then our advanced courses around those who have those safeguarding lead roles. And we have a course specifically designed for them, as well as safer recruitment. So for those who need to recruit volunteers and workers in the church. So yeah, in a nutshell, there's you know, that's kind of our services, but and anything in between. If that's helpful.
Very good. And can I just say, like, I just feel so glad that you guys are there and able to support churches in this area, and that, you know, there's somewhere to go for help and advice.
Yeah.
You're not on your own in this. You know, there are places you can go for support, and
Absolutely.
I think the stuff that you guys offer is absolutely brilliant. So thank you for what you do. It's really appreciated. So I guess one of the big questions that churches will be asking at the moment is how things have changed. You know, we're sat here, we're recording this in the middle of March. You know, we've been through lockdown after lockdown now. We've done online church, we've done hybrid church, we've done the church that once was. So how should our approach to safeguarding change in light of our audiences being different now? You know, some people are online, some are in buildings. You know, how should our approach be different now?
It's a really good question, and I think it's important first and foremost that we remember that safeguarding is still a thing. It's still important for churches, and I guess, you know, 12 months ago we were all kind of plunged into, let's close our doors, close our schools, let's stay at home, let's close our churches. What do we do? And you know, being fair to churches, I'm not sure that many people thought about safeguarding perhaps, and we certainly kind of experienced that at our end in terms of a drop in calls to our helpline, a drop in engagement in services to a degree. But the reality is that, you know, we are here 12 months on, we've seen that pandemic, kind of how it's impacted us. And I think that we just need to remember that safeguarding hasn't gone away. And that we still need to keep it a priority. So in terms of, you know, what's changed, so much, nothing's changed in terms of the fact that we need to put safeguarding in place, but so much has changed in terms of how we do that and how we do that differently. So thinking about our audiences, and one of the things that, you know, I'm conscious of is the hybrid church is here to stay, that the audience, and I'm not sure that I kind of like the word audience, but in terms of whoever churches are engaging with, whoever in their midst, in terms of their members, their communities, I think what's important is that we know who they are, because what my sense is, and kind of things that I've been involved with over the last 12 months, is that the online church has created a much more diverse connection with people. So it's made it a much more inclusive and level playing field, which means that you may not necessarily know who you, and some churches are actually operating where they're live streaming. So they're not necessarily engaging in a Zoom platform like this, where they know people who they're engaging with. Some people are just pushing services out via a live stream, but who's at the other end? And I think if you don't have a sense of who's at the other end, then safeguarding is really tricky, because you don't know what you're pushing out, who's that impacting, what does that mean for people pastorally, from a safeguarding perspective on one level, and where do people feed back in their concerns, their worries, their anxieties, whatever that might be. So I think that that's a real challenge, and I know you're going to ask me about challenges later perhaps, but I just think that in terms of, you know, safeguarding and what's different now, I would say that nothing in some respects. Keep doing what you were always doing, But because you're online, I think the key things is thinking about, what does that look like for your church now? Have you considered what that means? If you're engaging with children and young people online, do you have a code of conduct? Is there accountability in place for people? So if you connect, if youth workers are connecting with young people online, what does that look like? What accountability structure exists within that? Who knows who's doing what? Are you still recruiting people safely to do that work, even though they may not be having direct contact with children and young people, as an example? Or if people are doing pastoral care online, is there an accountability structure? Do we know when that's happening and who's doing that, and how do people get support around that, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. And, I think it's so much easier for some of this to be a bit more invisible, isn't it?
Yeah,
In an online environment. Like you say, we don't know who's on the other end, do we,
yeah,
necessarily? And some platforms are really open to anyone joining. I've had some churches that have said, we've gone international, and I'm like, that's great. But and also then there's there's the Zoom calls and the stuff where you know the people that are on there, don't
yeah,
you? And I think that is a real challenge, isn't it? It's that
yeah,
invisible kind of, someone can come and be a part of what you're doing, and you have no idea who they are or what
yeah,
background they're from, or how they're going to engage with your platform. So
yeah,
I guess that kind of leads us into our next question, really, which is, what are some of the biggest safeguarding challenges we face when we work in an online environment, and how
yeah.
can we overcome them?
I think one of the challenges, and speaking just from my own experience of doing church online, is that it's a different space to the face-to-face space. It's not, and I want to just stress that I don't think it's one is better than the other. I think that, I think what the pandemic has taught us is that we can do things differently, and that the online space has actually opened up the doors to so many other people. And I think that's a really good thing. But what is different about the online space is that it doesn't give opportunity for people to have one-to-one connections easily, unless you're intentional about that. So if you're doing church online, so if you're using a Zoom platform as an example, and you think you've got everybody in the room and you know them, my experience is that people often hold back. Not everybody's comfortable in this space. It works for some people, but not for everyone. And therefore, if people have safeguarding concerns or worries, where do they go with that? I think in the offline space and in face-to-face, it's much easier to grab someone and say, hey, can I just have a chat with you about this, or I'm concerned about this? Or whereas in the online space, everyone's in a group, you kind of have to raise your hand to speak, or you have to kind of try and get your word in. That's really tricky. And it's not a place where people are going to share safeguarding concerns, in my experience. So it's how as a church can you be intentional about giving space, about where do people go, how do people know how to kind of express their concerns or report things that they're worried about. I think that's one of the challenges, and the way to overcome that is to make sure that your safeguarding processes reflect your online engagement. So where people can't just pull somebody to the side and say, can I have a chat with you about that? What do they do instead? Do they, at the end of the service, have they got someone they can call, or say, can I just have a few minutes with you afterwards? How do they do that without kind of breaching confidentiality and all sorts of things? But yeah, for me, that's the key challenge working online. But also, it depends on the audience again, whether you're working with children and young people, how are you engaging with them, with parents' kind of consent and what's happening in the background. Schools have had the massive challenge as an example of trying to engage with children and young people, and the safeguarding issues that come with that in terms of not having cameras on and not being able to see them. But then how do you really engage with young people if you can't see them, if they can't see you? And I guess that's, churches aren't operating in the same way that schools are, I'm sure, and they are engaging with children online and they can see them. But what are the safeguarding implications around that? There are challenges there that need to be overcome, and that's easily overcome by speaking to parents, getting parents involved in engagement so they know what you're doing, and being transparent about what what the outcomes are, what you're expected to kind of achieve in that time online with children and young people in particular.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Claudia. And so I suppose it's also worth us thinking in this time about, lockdown easing and going back to in-person gatherings. So what should churches prepare themselves for now when they're returning to that setting? Um,
Yeah,
I think that there's a whole bunch of things that we've put down for a long time, isn't there,
yeah,
in this pandemic, and now we're starting to think about how do we pick those back up again. So
yeah.
I think it's a really helpful question to say, how do we prepare for that, and how do we prepare for hybrid church?
Yeah. Again, really good question, and we've been having these debates again in my own church weekly for the past few weeks about what does that look like. And I think a couple of things. So we've done some research recently. So we've got some timely research around the impact of COVID-19 for safeguarding leads, and we're hoping that that's going to give us some steer and insight into what they're thinking they are going to need coming out of this. And we're hoping to be able to give some headlines and some key themes by the end of June. So before we just, I think 21st of June, we're due to, if all things go well, we're due to kind of officially come out of lockdown, aren't we, and be slightly freer. So we're hoping that will give us some insights. But I think the reality is it's been a really tough year for people. We know that, and the impact on people's mental health. So, people have lost loved ones. People have developed a whole range of worries and anxieties about being kept indoors and what it's going to feel like going back outside and living and breathing in the world again. And so the impact on people's mental health is a key one. 318, we've just partnered with Kitsungi Hope, and you may have heard of them, Patrick Regan, and it's crucial for us that I think for me there's a link between safeguarding and mental health going forward. So I think churches, if they can prepare themselves to be a listening ear for people and providing that space, so equipping themselves with good pastoral teams. I appreciate that not all churches have big pastoral teams. There may be churches that are quite small, but giving some thought to how they're going to listen and provide space for people to talk about what's gone on for them, what it means for them, what the past 12 months has meant for them, and how that might make them, that's making them feel, and what they're going to do going forward, I think is really key. But also, you may have picked this up previously as well, that when we came out of the first lockdown last year and children and young people went back to school, there was a real spike in disclosures for children and young people, because although people have been asked to stay at home and not leave, abuse continues to happen. It's continued to happen. And there hasn't necessarily been a forum or a space for people to report that, or for other people to kind of pick that up and see the signs and indicators of that. Yeah. So I think churches need to prepare themselves for a spike or an increase in disclosures of abuse from children and young people, but also from adults who've been in difficult situations. So again, the news, you would have seen the impact of people being impacted by domestic abuse. So people who have had difficult situations where that the whole lockdown has just impacted that further. So they've just not been able to necessarily talk about that, and then when they come back to meeting with people, they may have an opportunity to do that.
Thanks, Claudia. That is really helpful. And I suppose one final question for you today. If you could list 3 things churches should prioritise when it comes to safeguarding, what would those be? It might be hard to just pick 3. You might say, well, actually, there's 10. But I think, what should churches be prioritising at this time?
Yeah. There probably is more than 3, but trying to be succinct, I think crucially, review your policies and procedures as a church. And ensure that it includes your online engagement. So if you are planning to go forward and continue with any level of online engagement and adopt a hybrid church approach, then review your policies and procedures and make sure that it's fit for purpose, so it reflects that work that you're doing online. If you're working with children and young people in particular, we've produced an online resource with Youthscape to help you think about some of the kind of practicalities around that. It's available on our website, it's free, you can download it, it's there. But also, another thing is about reviewing the culture of the church. So one of the things that I always say to people and to churches is safeguarding part of your DNA? Is it something that people understand to the depth that they need to understand according to their role as a volunteer, or whether they're a leader, wherever they sit in the church, do they have an understanding of safeguarding that's relevant for them? Is it in the DNA? What messages are communicated from the top down? So we're talking a lot recently about healthy cultures in churches, having a healthy safeguarding culture, and making sure that people value its importance, and why it's important. So not just thinking about the practicality, the practical things are really important. So, making sure that you recruit people safely, making sure that you train people well and equip them to do the jobs that you want them to do. But the culture, what people truly believe and their attitudes to safeguarding is actually what's going to hold it together. So I think an opportunity now, as we come out of lockdown, to think about what is our attitude to safeguarding. How do we kind of go forward creating a healthy culture is two. And then I think equipping. So what we're aware of is that lots of churches have had people furloughed. If they've had paid members of staff, we've had volunteers that have just stopped doing stuff. There may have been a little bit of activity online engagement, but actually they may be rusty in their knowledge of safeguarding and what that means, and how do I report, and who do I report to, and who's our safeguarding lead, and what does that mean? So just getting people to refresh their memories. So do some training. We've launched just a month ago our basic safeguarding awareness course, which is really great for people if they're just thinking about, if they're new to safeguarding, or they just want to refresh their memory on some of the key things that they need to know. Equip your staff, speak to them, listen to their needs, think about, what is it that we need to know? What have we forgotten? What do we need to refresh our memory on? Let's get training on that. Have a look at the range of training courses that we have. So yeah, I'd say, just to review that, reviewing your policies and procedures, have a look at those, review your culture, what's the attitudes and beliefs and value that people place on safeguarding, and then equip your workforce. Look at what training courses and what training needs people have to get them back on the ground again, and working on the coalface, as we say.
That is so good. Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you for your time.
You're very
For
welcome.
your input. It's really helpful. And we just really appreciate your insight into this area. And I hope this is really useful for churches as they begin to think about reopening their doors, but also as they continue to review how they work in an online space as well. So
Yeah.
that's really helpful. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you for asking us, and I hope it is helpful. And if people need advice and support, then they know where to find us. Look at our website, ring our helpline. Absolutely.
That's great. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you.